In the summer of 1202, a crusading army sat stranded on a sandbank outside Venice, beside a fleet built for nearly 3 times its actual numbers, unable to leave because it could not pay the shipping bill. Most of us were taught the Crusades as a story about faith. A pope preached, Europe answered. Armies marched east to take Jerusalem, and for 2 centuries Christendom and Islam fought over a city both considered holy. The sermons were real. The belief was real. Men genuinely walked 3,000 miles believing it would save their souls. But follow the money underneath that story, and the shape of it changes. The Crusades were not only a religious movement, they also produced one of the largest transfers of land and commercial privilege in medieval European history, and the men who ended up holding the assets were rarely the men who did the fighting. Going on crusade was ruinously expensive, and very few men could finance it out of income. Many became debtors, others became forced sellers. Either way, the departure date handed the leverage to whoever was holding the money, and leverage compounds. Along the way, you will meet a blind Venetian in his 90s who turned a bankrupt crusade into the conquest of the richest Christian city on earth. You will meet an army that sacked 2 Christian cities and never reached Jerusalem at all. You will meet a military order that invented something very close to the traveler's check and was destroyed by the king who owed it money. You will see a pilgrim trade so profitable that Christian and Muslim merchants kept it running through the same ports the armies were fighting over. And you will see a papal privilege, granted with the best intentions, that quietly made monasteries and bishops the major buyers and lenders in the crusading land market. So let's go back not to 1095 but to 1082 and a trade treaty. In that year, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios Komnenos, desperate for a navy he did not have, signed a crucible for the merchants of Venice. It gave them the right to trade throughout his empire in a long list of ports, free of the customs duties every other merchant paid, not reduced duties, none. Venetian traders in Constantinople could now undercut Byzantine traders in their own capital. Why would an emperor sign that? The answer sits 11 years earlier. In 1071, a Byzantine army had been defeated at Manzikert and the reigning emperor taken alive, a devastating political humiliation, and Anatolia, the empire's recruiting ground and breadbasket, had begun slipping away to the Seljuks. Alexios needed ships and men urgently, and had nothing left to pay with except privileges. So he sold the future for the present, which is the oldest transaction in this story and the one every chapter of it repeats. That grant detonated 120 years later. Byzantine merchants spent the next century watching foreigners undersell them at home, and in 1171, an emperor finally acted on that resentment in a way that made everything afterwards possible. Now the machinery. To understand why the Crusades bent toward money, you have to understand what a knight actually was in economic terms. He was not a salaried soldier. He was a landholder whose land produced income in kind, grain, labor, rents, and who owed military service in exchange for holding it. That system could equip a man for a local campaign lasting weeks. It could not fund an expedition of 3 years across a continent. The numbers are brutal. Modern estimates suggest that going on crusade cost a knight somewhere in the region of 4 to 5 times his annual income, and for a great lord the multiple was similar against a far larger base. He had to buy war horses, and war horses died constantly. He had to feed and pay a retinue. He had to buy passage by sea or provisions by land for years. A single trained war horse could cost the equivalent of several years of a peasant household's entire output, and a knight on campaign needed more than one. Horses died of heat, thirst, disease, and arrows at a rate that appalled everyone who wrote about it. Add armor, add a squire, add 3 years of food for men who could not forage in a desert, and the sum stops being a large purchase and becomes a liquidation event. There was no bank to go to. So he did the only thing available. He turned land into cash. And here is where the story gets strange, because in 11th century Europe, only a few institutions combined liquid wealth, legal continuity, and the organization to take land as security and hold it for decades. Marchand lent. Jewish moneylenders lent and would pay horribly for it. Great magnates bought from lesser ones, but the buyer with the deepest reserves and the longest memory was the church. The immediate trigger was a request for help. In March 1095, at the Council of Piacenza, envoys from Alexios asked the West for mercenaries against the Turks. What Alexios wanted was a manageable body of paid professional soldiers under his command. What arrived, 4 years later, was a mass movement of tens of thousands of armed Westerners with their own leadership, their own objectives, and no intention of handing conquered cities to anybody. That gap between what was asked for and what turned up is the first thing that went wrong, and it never stopped mattering. When Pope Urban II preached the crusade at Clermont on the 27th of November 1095, he offered remission of sins to those who went. What the sermon did not spell out was the balance sheet consequence. Across the next 4 years, thousands of fighting men sold, were mortgaged estates, forests, mills and rights to monasteries and bishops to raise traveling money, usually at prices that reflected a seller with no time and no alternatives. The market moved the way any market moves when thousands of sellers appear at once and every one of them has a departure date. Nobody can reconstruct a general price level for medieval land, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But in several crusading regions, the surviving charters show hurried sales and mortgages made under the pressure of a fixed departure date. Some of them look less like ordinary transactions than like distress sales. Godfrey of Bouillon, who would end up ruling Jerusalem, financed his departure by disposing of his patrimony to the church. Robert, Duke of Normandy, pledged his entire duchy to his brother, the King of England, for 10,000 marks of silver. That is, a duke pawning a country. And a crusader, who died abroad, and enormous numbers did, never redeemed his mortgage. The land stayed with the lender. I want to be careful here, because there is a lazy version of this argument that says the church invented the Crusades to acquire property, and that is not what the evidence shows. Monasteries often paid fair prices, sometimes stripped their own treasuries to do it, and many of these transactions left the lender short of cash for years. The historian Giles Constable, who spent a career on the 12th century record, described the land market of the crusading decades as a genuine scramble on both sides rather than a scheme. But intention is one thing, and outcome is another. Whatever anybody meant, the century after 1095 saw a substantial and often permanent shift of land from the warrior aristocracy to ecclesiastical institutions, and the mechanism was the crusade. Before we follow that land east, look at who was paying for it. In a currency nobody wrote down. The great lords are named in every chronicle. The men who actually walked are not. A peasant levy or a poor knight's retainer sold what he had to equip himself, then walked into a climate that killed men by the thousand before any battle. For a frightening number of these men, the journey ended long before they ever saw Jerusalem. When that happened, the family at home lost both the man and the land he had pledged to go. The People's Crusade of 1096, thousands of ordinary people who set out ahead of the armies, was destroyed almost entirely in Anatolia within weeks of crossing. And on the way there, in the Rhineland, some of those same bands massacred Jewish communities in Speyer, Worms, and Mainz, in part to seize the assets of the very moneylenders who had been financing departures. Local bishops in several towns tried to shelter them, and in some places failed. The chroniclers of those towns put the dead in the high hundreds and low thousands per community. Religious hatred drove that violence, and I want to be exact about it. Plunder, outstanding debts, and the burning of bonds and account rolls also shaped some of the attacks. They do not explain the massacres by themselves. But where the records burned, the debt burned with the lender. That is the part of the story I find hardest to walk past. The first mass violence of the crusading era was not directed at a distant enemy at all. It fell on neighbors, and some of those neighbors were creditors within reach. And for the survivors of the campaigns, there was a second bill waiting. A knight who came home after 3 or 4 years came home to an estate that had been mortgaged to a monastery, farmed by someone else, and valued at a redemption price he now had to find in coin. Some managed it, many sold what remained. The crusade did not only kill men, it quietly reorganized who owned Europe. Now, let's talk about something the conventional narrative gets badly wrong, which is who actually won the First Crusade. Jerusalem fell on the 15th of July, 1099, and the Crusaders established 4 states along the coast. Those states had a problem from birth. They were a thin strip of territory with a permanently insufficient garrison, 3 months sailing from home, and they could only be supplied by sea. That meant they belonged, operationally, to whoever owned the ships. Genoa, Pisa, and Venice supplied the fleets, and they did not do it for indulgences. In return for naval support at the sieges of the coastal cities, they took quarters in each captured port. Each quarter came with its own streets, its own churches, and its own courts, exemption from local tolls, and in some cases a fixed share of the city itself, commonly a third. The Crusaders got the kingdom, the Italians got the ports. A merchant quarter in Acre or Tyre meant warehouse space at the water. A court that answered to Genoa or Venice rather than to the King of Jerusalem, and freedom from the tolls that every rival paid. Acre in the 13th century was reportedly generating more annual revenue for the Crown of Jerusalem than the whole of England generated for its king, and a substantial share of the traffic through it moved under Italian flags at Italian rates. The Crusader states, meanwhile, were chronically short of men. Estimates of the settled Frankish population across all 4 states run to only a few 100,000 at the peak, defending a coastline against neighbors who could raise armies many times larger. That imbalance is why the shipping contracts mattered more than any battle. Over the 12th century that produced something the sermons never mentioned. Christian and Muslim merchants traded briskly through those same harbors, in sugar, glass, silk, spices, and cotton, while the armies fought inland. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa grew from regional ports into the wealthiest commercial powers in the Mediterranean on the back of a religious war they largely financed rather than fought. And out of the same conditions came the other great financial innovation of the period. A pilgrim traveling to Jerusalem had a specific and terrible problem. He had to carry money across 2,000 miles of road, and money in the 12th century meant metal, visible, heavy, and worth killing for. The Knights Templar solved it. Founded around 1119 to protect pilgrims on the road, formally endorsed at the Council of Troyes in 1129, the order expanded into a network of preceptories running from Ireland to Palestine. A pilgrim deposited his valuables at his local house, received a document recording the value, and drew against it on arrival. No treasure traveled, only paper. The system did something recognizably similar to a letter of credit. Value moved through the network while the metal stayed where it was. It was not banking as a Florentine would later understand it, and the surviving records are patchier than the legend suggests. But the principle was there, 400 years before the great Italian houses made it famous. What made it possible was a papal decision. In 1139, the bull Omni Datum Optimum placed the Templars outside every jurisdiction except the popes, exempt from taxation, and answerable to no bishop or king. In modern language, the church chartered a tax-exempt multinational and then let it hold everyone's money. The order became banker to Europe. At its height, it held thousands of estates and properties across Christendom, by one often quoted estimate around 9,000 from Irish farmland to Palestinian castles, and the Paris Temple functioned for decades as the effective treasury of the French crown. It moved ransoms, dowries, and papal taxes. It lent to kings. It held deposits for people who were not going anywhere at all, because a vault that no bishop and no king could legally open was the safest place in Europe to leave anything. The structure is worth stating plainly. The Templars enjoyed sweeping tax exemptions, answered to no local court, moved money across every border in Christendom, and were regulated by exactly one authority, sitting in Rome, whose own finances they also handled. Hold on to who ends up owing them. It becomes the last act of this story. But first, the moment the whole logic of the Crusades became visible, in one bankruptcy, in one lagoon. In 1201, 6 French envoys came to Venice to charter a fleet. The Venetians offered terms that were, by the standards of the day, entirely reasonable, and by any standard, enormous. They would build and crew a fleet to carry 33,500 men, 4,500 knights, 4,500 horses, 9,000 squires, and 20,000 foot soldiers, and provision it for a year. 50 war galleys and 450 transports. The price was 85,000 silver marks. There was one more clause, and it is the clause that explains everything. Venice would not merely be paid, it would also take half of all conquests, land and plunder alike, for the duration of the expedition. The Venetians were not hauliers. They were partners with a fixed fee and an equity stake, which meant they had a direct financial interest in where the fleet went and what it took when it got there. To build that fleet, Venice effectively shut down its own commerce and put its entire working population into the arsenal, shipwrights, rope makers, sailmakers, and carpenters for 12 months on the strength of a signed promise from 6 Frenchmen. The city bet itself on the contract. Then the army did not turn up. Perhaps 12,000 men arrived instead of 33,500. Many had made their own arrangements from other ports. And here is the detail that decides everything that follows. The price was not per man. It was for the fleet. The fleet existed. The bill was due. The Crusaders scraped together 35,000 marks, then squeezed out roughly 14,000 more by collecting the private funds of the leaders, and stopped. They were short by around 36,000 marks, and they were sitting on the Lido, on an island, eating Venetian food on credit, with a fleet they could not pay for and no way home that did not involve public humiliation. The doge of Venice was Enrico Dandolo, a man of extraordinary age, probably in his 90s, and completely blind. The blindness matters to the legend. A later Russian chronicle claimed the Byzantine emperor had blinded him deliberately with glass during a diplomatic mission, which would make everything that followed a revenge story. The historian Thomas Madden went through the evidence and concluded something less cinematic. Dandolo's eyes appeared undamaged. He had almost certainly suffered cortical blindness from a heavy blow to the back of the head in the middle 1170s. He could not see a hand in front of his face. But he had been in Constantinople in 1171, when the emperor ordered the mass arrest of every Venetian in the empire and the seizure of their goods, thousands of people ruined in a day. He did not need mythology to hold a grudge. He had an invoice. So Dandolo made an offer. Postpone the debt. In exchange, help Venice recover the port city of Zara on the Adriatic, which had thrown off Venetian control and put itself under the protection of the King of Hungary. The King of Hungary was a crusader. Look at what was being asked. A crusading army, sworn to fight the enemies of Christendom, was being invited to besiege a Catholic city belonging to a king who had himself taken the cross on behalf of the shipping contractor in lieu of an overdue payment. Several of the French leaders said exactly that out loud. Some left the expedition rather than take part. The Cistercian abbot Guy of Vaux-de-Cernay reportedly stood up before the assault and told the army the Pope forbade it. They did it anyway, and the reason is the least dramatic sentence in this entire story. They had no ships of their own, no money, and no way home. Zara fell on the 24th of November, 1202, and Pope Innocent III excommunicated the army for attacking a Christian city under papal protection. He lifted it for the French, largely because the alternative was losing the crusade entirely. Consider the position that put the papacy in. Pope Innocent III had called this crusade, had preached it, had taxed the clergy to help fund it, and had explicitly forbidden attacks on Christians. He was, on paper, the most powerful man in Europe, and he could not stop an army that had already been bought, because spiritual authority gave him little practical control over a fleet Venice owned and an army trapped by debt. A pope could threaten damnation. He could not offer transport. Then, wintering in the ruins of Zara, they received a visitor with a proposal. Alexios Angelos was the son of a deposed Byzantine emperor. "Put me on my father's throne," he said, "and I will pay you 200,000 silver marks, settle your entire debt to Venice, supply 10,000 soldiers for the campaign in Egypt, and place the Eastern Church under the authority of Rome." 200,000 marks, more than twice the original contract for the whole fleet. It was, on inspection, a fantasy. The young man had no money, no support inside the city, and no realistic way to raise a sum on that scale. But look at the position of the men hearing it. They were excommunicate, in debt, on somebody else's ships, and here was a solution that solved everything, including their sins, since church union would surely please the Pope. They sailed for Constantinople in the summer of 1203. Alexios was installed as co-emperor in August. He then discovered what everyone else already knew. The treasury was empty, the promise was uncollectible, and the population despised him for arriving with a foreign army. He melted down church plate to make partial payment. In January 1204, he was strangled by a rival, and the new regime repudiated the debt entirely. That left an army encamped outside the walls of the wealthiest Christian city in the world, owed a fortune it would never be paid, with nothing left to lose. The city fell on the 12th of April, 1204, and the sack lasted 3 days. I am not going to narrate the atrocities, and there were many. I want you to look at what was done with the assets, because that is where this stops being chaos and becomes accounting. The scale of the plunder is disputed, and I am going to give you the conservative version. Villehardouin, who was there, recorded that 50,000 silver marks went to Venice in settlement of the debt, and that a further 100,000 were divided between the army and the Venetians. He also admitted that a great deal never reached the common pool at all, taken and hidden by individual soldiers. His own estimate of the true total was not less than 400,000 marks. Set even that low figure beside the original shipping bill of 85,000 and you can see the scale. Then came the partition treaty, and this is the part that tells you who was really running the expedition. Venice took 3/8 of the Byzantine Empire, chosen with a merchant's precision. Not the expensive interior, but the harbors, the islands, the sea lanes. Crete, the Aegean chain, the approaches to the Black Sea. Venice did not want an empire. It wanted the route. The Fourth Crusade never went to Jerusalem. It never fought a Muslim army. It began as a mission to Egypt and ended by sacking and occupying the largest Christian city on earth and permanently crippling the empire that had been Europe's eastern shield. The sack did not by itself cause the Ottoman conquest of 1453, but it left damage and fragmentation that no later restoration ever fully reversed. The empire that replaced it lasted 57 years and was a shell. The Latin Empire of Constantinople held the city until 1261, poor, hated by its own population, propped up by the same Italian shipping that had installed it. When the Byzantines finally took the city back, they inherited a capital stripped of its relics, its bronze, its coined silver, and much of its population. They never recovered the fiscal base, the manpower, or the naval power the empire had held before 1204. The population estimates before and after the sack differ wildly, but all of them move the same way. Enrico Dandolo died in Constantinople in 1205, aged somewhere around 98, and Villehardouin records that he was buried inside Hagia Sophia. The marker shown to visitors today is a much later memorial, and the exact site of the grave is still argued over. The 4 bronze horses he shipped home stood over the entrance to St. Mark's for the next 600 years. There is one more consequence, and it outlived every man involved. The Eastern and Western churches had been formally split since 1054, but the split was still, in 1200, a quarrel among bishops that ordinary people barely felt. After 1204, it was something else. A Western army had sacked the greatest city of Eastern Christianity, stripped its churches, and installed a Latin patriarch by force. The story the Eastern Church told about the West from that point on had a sack in it, and it still does. The crusade that was supposed to reunite Christendom hardened the division for centuries. And there is a last account to settle, because the financial institution the crusading movement had created eventually received an invoice of its own. By the early 14th century, the Templars had lost the Holy Land, which was their reason to exist, and retained their wealth, their exemptions, and their reputation for having it. Philip IV of France had spent years at war with England, had debased his coinage, had already expelled and expropriated Jewish and Lombard bankers, and owed the order a great deal of money. On Friday, the 13th of October, 1307, every Templar in France was arrested in a single coordinated dawn operation on charges assembled to justify the seizure of an institution the Pope had made untouchable. Confessions were extracted under torture and later retracted. In 1312, at the Council of Vienne, Clement V dissolved the order. The last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned on an island in the Seine in March 1314. He is reported to have said, from the fire, that God knew who had sinned, and that misfortune would soon come to those who had condemned them. Philip IV died that November, aged 46. Clement V had died the previous April. Both facts are true, and both are almost certainly coincidence. And the story has been told for 700 years anyway, because it is more comfortable to believe in a curse than in the plainer explanation. On paper, most of the Templar property was transferred to the Hospitallers. In practice, Philip held it for years and deducted enormous sums from it as the costs of the investigation he had ordered, which is a phrase worth sitting with. Malcolm Barber, who wrote the standard study of the trial, is clear that the debt was not the only motive. There was also a king's long quarrel with the papacy, and his intolerance of an armed, tax-exempt corporation operating inside his kingdom and answerable to Rome. But the sequence is not in dispute. A king destroyed a creditor he could not control and made the liquidation help pay for the trial. Now, this is exactly where a video like this can lose its credibility, so let me be precise about what historians actually argue. There is an old theory, still popular online, that the whole Fourth Crusade was a Venetian conspiracy from the beginning, that Dandolo planned the destruction of Constantinople from the day the envoys walked in. Donald Queller and Thomas Madden went carefully through the sources and argued the opposite, that the crusade was a chain of improvised decisions, each rational at the moment it was taken, which produced a catastrophe nobody designed. The counter-argument is that Venice's commercial interests were served so precisely by the outcome that calling it accidental strains belief. There is a second and older quarrel underneath that one about the Crusades as a whole. For most of the 20th century, the dominant frame, associated with Stephen Runciman's 3 volumes, treated the whole enterprise as a barbarian intrusion into a more civilized Eastern world, morally indefensible and strategically pointless. A later generation, Jonathan Riley Smith, above all, argued that Runciman had written a magnificent polemic rather than a history. Read the charters, the wills and the loan documents, he said, and you find men making enormous, uncalculated sacrifices for reasons they plainly believed. Riley Smith's case rests on exactly the same financial evidence I have been describing, read the other way. The mortgages prove devotion, not cynicism. I think both readings survive contact with the documents, and the reason is simple. A man can ruin himself for God and still end up serving the interests of the person who bought his land. I lean toward the accident reading with one qualification that I think matters. You do not need a conspiracy when you have a debt. A creditor with leverage does not have to plan an outcome. He only has to be present at every decision, holding the note, and let each choice narrow the next. Now, let me bring all of these threads together, because none of these pieces alone explains 2 centuries of holy war. Start with a form of warfare that cost several years of a knight's income in a society with no banking system. For many crusaders, the practical way to go was to convert land into silver at a discount, and the deepest reserves in that market belonged to the church. Add a network of Italian maritime republics that supplied the transport and took ports, tax exemptions, and trade quarters as their fee. The crusader states became economically dependent on their carriers. Then add a military order granted exemption from all tax and all jurisdiction below the Pope, which used that shelter to build one of medieval Europe's most extensive cross-border financial networks. And in 1202, a single unpayable invoice redirected an entire army away from its target and into the treasury of a Christian empire. Take any of those alone, and you have an interesting footnote. Put them together, and the Crusades stop looking like a war for a city and start looking like a powerful accelerator of Mediterranean commercial capitalism, running inside a movement that was genuinely religious. And the pattern did not stay in the Middle Ages. Expeditions justified by belief still require financing, and financing still comes with conditions. The mechanism is not medieval. Look at how any large collective effort actually gets paid for, and you find the same three questions the Crusaders faced. Who fronts the money? What do they hold as security? And what happens to that security if the enterprise fails or the borrower dies? Answer those three, and you can usually predict where an army, or a company, or a country will end up, regardless of what its founding documents say it is for. What the crusading centuries demonstrate with unusual clarity is how a genuine mass conviction, held by hundreds of thousands of people, can be steered by a much smaller number who control the ships, the credit, and the terms. None of those men has to be insincere about the cause. Dandolo, as far as anyone can tell, was a believer. So were the French barons who sacked a Christian city. Sincerity is not the variable that decides these things. The variable is who is owed, and what he is willing to accept instead of payment. The next time someone tells you the Crusades were a war between two religions over one city, you will know that the religion was real, and it was not the whole ledger. Faith got the armies moving. Debt decided where they went. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe. And tell me which of the three you would put first. Was it the mortgage market of 1095 that shifted estates across Europe into ecclesiastical hands? Was it the shipping contract of 1201 that redirected a crusade into Constantinople? Or was it the arrest warrant of 1307 that destroyed one of the largest financial networks on the continent? I read every single one. And if this held your attention for the last half hour, a like genuinely helps it reach people who were taught the other version.